This is the last deeply personal painting Caravaggio ever made. The severed head in it is his own face, and there is strong evidence he painted it, packed it up, and sent it directly to the one man who could still save his life. This is David with the head of Goliath, painted by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. Now hanging in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, most scholars date it to 1609 or 1610, right at the very end of his life, though a handful argue for an earlier date around 1605. Even the year it was painted is still debated. It shows the young David holding the severed head of Goliath by the hair, sword still in hand. But look at David's face. He isn't celebrating. There is no triumph here at all, just a heavy, almost grieving stillness, staring down at what he's just done. That alone breaks with almost every other version of this subject painted before it. Notice, too, how little of the canvas is actually lit. That's Caravaggio's signature technique, now called tenebrism. A single, harsh light source carving figures out of near, total black, as if they'd been caught for 1 second in the beam of a lamp. He didn't invent shadow in painting, but almost nobody before him had used that much of it, and the reason the mood here feels so different becomes a lot clearer once you know whose face. Art historians have agreed on this. For a very long time, this isn't a recent theory. As early as 1672, the biographer Giovanni Pietro Bellori recorded that Goliath's face was Caravaggio's own self-portrait. Most scholars today still accept it. Caravaggio didn't paint himself as the hero of this story. He painted himself as the monster, already dead, already judged, held up by the hair for everyone to see. This wasn't the first time he'd hidden his own face inside a painting, either. By some counts, Caravaggio worked a self-portrait into at least 10 of his works as the wine god Bacchus, sickly and pale, in one of his earliest Roman paintings, and as a terrified bystander, fleeing the scene in the martyrdom of St. Matthew. Glancing back in fear at a killing he can't stop, but every one of those earlier self-portraits, whatever their mood, still showed him alive. This is the only one where he paints himself already dead. To understand why an artist would do that to his own face, you have to go back 4 years, to a very real killing. On May 29th, 1606, in a district of Rome called Campo Marzio, Caravaggio killed a man named Ranuccio Tomasoni. Accounts differ on exactly how it started. Some say a dispute over a bet on a game of tennis, but the wound tells its own story. The surgeon's report describes a fatal cut to the femoral artery in the groin. Historians reading that report have suggested it looks less like an accident of combat and more like a deliberate attempt to maim him, which points toward a much more personal motive than a tennis wager. The Pope responded with a bando capitale, a formal death sentence. Legally, from that point on, anyone in the Papal States could kill Caravaggio on sight and be rewarded for it. Caravaggio didn't walk away from that fight unhurt. Either he was wounded in the neck himself. He first found shelter on estates belonging to the powerful Colonna family, who had a long-standing connection to him. Costanza Colonna was the Marchesa of Caravaggio, the Lombard town he was named after. He fled Rome that same year and didn't stop moving for the rest of his life. Naples, then Malta, then Sicily, then back to Naples again. 4 years as a fugitive with a price on his head. In Malta, something strange happened. Despite being a wanted killer, Caravaggio was made a Knight of the Order on the 14th of July, 1608, an honour so unusual for a fugitive that the Grand Master, Olof de Wignacourt, needed special papal permission just to accept him. It didn't happen out of nowhere. A year earlier, Caravaggio had painted a full-length portrait of Wignacourt himself, and the Grand Master was reportedly impressed enough to personally push the knighthood through talent, once again, quietly overriding a criminal record. While he held that title, he painted the beheading of St. John the Baptist, the largest canvas he ever produced, and the only painting he ever signed. He signed it in the blood pouring from the Baptist's severed neck. The knighthood didn't last. Within months he was jailed for another brawl, escaped from his cell, and fled the island before facing trial. The order's response was brutal and public. They formally stripped his title and denounced him in Latin as a putrid and foul limb, in the very room where he'd been knighted less than 5 months earlier. And that brings us back to the painting, because this is the part most people never learn. David with the head of Goliath wasn't painted for a church or a collector. According to most historians, Caravaggio sent it directly to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the nephew of Pope Paul V, and one of the most powerful men in Rome. He sent it as a plea for a pardon. Think about what that actually means. A man with a death sentence on his head painted his own severed, judged, punished face and mailed it to the one person with enough influence over the Pope to call off the killing. It isn't just a painting about guilt. By most accounts, it's a confession, a plea, and a business proposal, all folded into a single canvas, and Borghese wasn't picked at random. A few years earlier, in 1607, the cardinal had already acquired several of Caravaggio's paintings for his own collection, including an earlier self-portrait, The Sick Bacchus. Caravaggio wasn't gambling his life on a stranger's taste. He was appealing to a man who already owned his work and clearly valued it. There is one more layer. Some historians add to this, and it changes the entire meaning of the composition. A number of scholars argue that David's face, the young man holding the head, staring down at it with something close to pity, may also be a self-portrait. Caravaggio, painted as his own younger self. If that reading holds, this isn't just a killer painting his own punishment. It's a man near the end of his life, staring at the person he used to be, young, unstained, still capable of mercy, looking down at the ruin he'd become. It wouldn't have been the first time he'd painted his own younger face either. Years earlier, in his 20s, he'd painted himself as a sickly Bacchus, and as a fresh-faced boy with a basket of fruit, the same features some scholars now think they can trace. Years later, in David's downcast eyes. There is a detail on this canvas that stayed completely invisible for almost 400 years. Along the blade of David's sword, barely legible, even up close. 4 letters are inscribed, H, S, and O, S. It wasn't properly deciphered until between 1987 and 1990 by a handful of Caravaggio scholars working independently. Their reading, Humilitas occidit superbium. Humility kills pride. A killer, on the run for 4 years, painted a moral lesson about humility into the one weapon in the frame, in letters, so small they went unread for nearly 4 centuries. So look at this canvas one more time, the sword, the letters no one could read for 400 years, and that one face hanging by the hair, a killer's confession painted onto his own severed head. A younger, gentler version of himself, quietly asked to judge what he'd become, a knighthood earned and lost within 5 months, a letter of blood signed onto the largest canvas he ever made, and a plea for mercy, sent to exactly the right man in Rome. It worked. Cardinal Borghese's influence over his uncle, the Pope, reportedly helped secure the pardon Caravaggio had been chasing for 4 years. He never found out. Caravaggio died at Porto Ercole around the 18th of July, 1610, at 38 years old, and historians still genuinely disagree about what actually killed him. Some point to malaria, common enough along that stretch of coast. A 2018 medical study raised the possibility of untreated sepsis from a wound that never properly healed. Bone analysis from 2010 found toxic levels of lead in remains believed, with roughly even odds, to be his consistent with slow poisoning from the paint he used every day of his working life. And a more recent theory argues he was hunted down and killed outright in revenge by men connected to the same Knights of Malta who'd stripped his title less than 2 years earlier. 4 competing explanations. 400 years later, and still no final answer. The pardon reached the coast 3 days after he was already gone.